This is the Editor's Half Hour. Step into the life of an editor for 30 minutes as we discuss the craft of editing, industry trends, and editorial resources. Your host is co-founder and CEO of Peak Publishing Inc., Nadia Jaja Pupa. She is experienced in all facets of the publishing industry, from editing to design, and works with corporate clients and self-published authors. Nadia and her guests are about to share powerful insights and stories on what it takes to be an editor. And this is your host, Nadia Jaja Pupa.
Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Half Hour. This is the episode that I have been just dying to do. We are covering Romantasy, editing for Romantasy. Romantasy is such a thing, right? It's everywhere. It's all we talk about, especially the romance readers. That's all we want to talk about because it's such an exciting thing. But I have the best guest today. She is going to give us all the ins and outs. We're going to talk about everything Romantasy. But before we get into that, and before I introduce my fabulous speaker, if you're watching the video version of the podcast, I'm wearing hearts on my sweater because it's the month of February and Valentine's is right around the corner. And I am so excited to share that I am one of the sponsors at the Love LitCon in San Diego. If you are in the San Diego area, if you live on the West Coast, come visit me. I will have a booth. I will be moderating a panel of romance writers. And I just want to remind you if you're not already a subscriber to my newsletter, please subscribe because I will be sharing a promo code to get $25 off the registration fee at the Love LitCon. So visit lovelit.com to see the wonderful lineup of romance writers. I mean, this is just so exciting. And will be my very first time attending this type of thing. And I'm seeing a lot of really great things on Instagram. So follow Love LitCon, look for them on Instagram, check out the website, and sign up for my newsletter to get the promo if you're interested in coming. So we are ready to get into Romantasy editing. I have Brenna Bailey Davies as my guest. And welcome, Brenna. Please introduce yourself to the listeners. Tell them about all the wonderful things that you edit and how you got into editing.
Hi, Nadia. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be on the show. My name is Brenna. I am an editor for science fiction and fantasy and romance. So I have a little bit of a broad spectrum, but I niche down because I focus on stories with queer representation. I am also an author. I have 5 books currently published. They are sapphic romance, so that's kind of my writing niche. And how I got into editing, it was I'm one of those weird people that didn't really have a career before editing. I was in university trying to figure out what I was trying to do, and I was kind of debating between library science or editing. Oh. And then I started dating my now husband, and he was like, oh, we could have a life where we could travel, so maybe you want to do something flexible. And I was like, you know what? Editing is flexible. I could do that. So, yes. And I always wanted to work like with books, like in publishing or some kind of, literary sphere. So that's kind of why I picked that, except the funny part is we have never lived a life of travel, so that flexibility part that we wanted didn't come into play the way I thought it would, but I still love my job, so.
You're doing what you love, clearly, you know?
Yeah.
And that's all that matters. So this is so great. So I think I already posted on socials about this interview, and so excited to share that you're an author as well. And I think that is also just the icing on the cake because you know the craft, you know what goes into the writer's process, the writer's mind. And so that's why you're so valuable as a guest on this podcast, because you can share your firsthand experience of what the writer is experiencing when it's with the copy editor. It's a scary moment, right? It has to be. It is. It has to be.
I mean, I find it fun, but I think that's because I am an editor, so I kind of get it.
Yeah. For me, side note is someday, maybe when I hit retirement, I will become an author. I hope to become an author, right? And it wasn't until I had one of those like daydream moments where I'm like, what is it going to feel like when my someday manuscript is in the hands of a copy editor? By thinking about the writing process, the editorial process, it actually created the idea for starting to offer manuscript evaluation. So that's one of the big things I do, because I thought, well, let's prep this manuscript before we find major errors, and prep it before it goes to the copy editor.
And I always get manuscript evaluations because like that's invaluable for me.
It isn't it? It's such
Yeah.
an important part. And then let's start with romance specifically, but then how it evolved into romantasy. Let's just break it down. Let's just start for beginners, somebody who maybe has never ventured into the romantasy world. What is it? How would you describe it, Brenna? If you met somebody and they were
So-
like, "What is this?"
Okay, so on a basic level, romantasy is a genre where the fantasy elements and the romantic elements are equally important to the story. But when you get kind of into it a little more, you see how complex that is because there's no like, you can't read a book and be like, oh yeah, 50% is romance and 50% is romantasy. So it's a perfect romantasy book. Like it's a lot more nuanced than that. So even if you look at any given list of romantasy books, you'll see how difficult it is to say, yes, this book is romantasy or no, this book isn't, just because there's a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah. And let's look at fantasy. Let's dissect that too. So let's break that down. What are the elements that make a book a fantasy book? Are there different types of subcategories or whatever you'd want to call it within fantasy?
Yeah, so there definitely are. I think when people think about romantasy, it's usually they're thinking like a high fantasy or epic fantasy. So something like Sarah J. Maas's ACOTAR series or Fourth Wing, those are like high fantasy. So that's fantasy that is set in a world completely different than our own, that has its own cultures, its own environment, its own magical rules, that kind of thing. But you can also have romantasy that falls into different fantasy categories like urban fantasy, for example, which is fantasy that is set in our world. So it's usually contemporary. It's a society that is pretty much exactly like ours, except it has a little bit of magic in it. And then you can get even deeper into that and go to like paranormal romantasy, which is our world again, but it has like vampires or werewolves or fae or other creatures like that in it. And then you can also get even deeper and go to something like, say, historical romantasy, which is again set in our world, usually something like Regency era or Victorian era or medieval. But again, there's like an aspect of fantasy or magic in that world.
And that's what is so fun and enticing, and it's just drawing so much attention. But I think the romance elements have really created this I guess frenzy. I don't know what the word is for the romantasy world. And I want to get into those nuances too, and what you have to consider as an editor when you're working with these types of manuscripts. So I've read those books that you mentioned. Those are the mainstream ones that everybody is just, the fan base is just wild for these books. And I'm finishing, I think it's Brimstone. That's the sequel to the Quicksilver books, and everybody loves those. And I do like them. However, the more you read these, you start to see repetitive things in terms of the romance aspect, maybe the magical things, like the similar, maybe even descriptions for things, like the grotesque characters even have similar traits. And it's starting to get a little bit on that repetitive side. So let's just rewind a little bit and go back to just the term romantasy. And I didn't even realize this until you opened my eyes to this, Brenna, which is that just the term itself can actually be controversial in some ways. Right now we're using it, and that's what we have to use to describe what we're talking about. But I want you to explain, how it does present some problematic things. I'd like to have you share your insight about that.
Yeah, so although I edit a lot of romantasy, I kind of have strong feelings about the term itself because, like you said, it can be problematic. And a lot of people don't really realize that if they're just especially in the reader sphere. But so romantasy as a idea has been around for a long time. Like having romance in fantasy and strong romance strong romance storylines in fantasy, that's not a new thing. But the term romantasy itself is. And I think it came about, there's no like real start point for like, where it came from, but it sort of started in indie publishing and then it took off with things like ACOTAR and Fourth Wing and, Book Talk and everyone going nuts over these things.
Yes.
People wanted to capitalize on that. And so, publishers and writers saw that this was popular and started writing more of it and promoting more of it, and it just grew. But the problem is that the term itself, like the term romantasy, has been applied mostly to books written by women. So even if there are fantasy books with strong romance lines in them that are written by men, those don't generally get categorized as romantasy. Whereas almost any fantasy with even like a tiny bit of romance in it, if it's written by a woman, it's categorized as romantasy. So there's kind of this aspect of, like, how romance has been kind of belittled as a genre throughout history?
Yes.
People see it as, they write it off as smut or fluff or, something that's not as important, it's not as meaningful, or it's not
Right.
as lofty, it's not real literature,
Right.
So that has kind of been applied to romantasy in some ways. And so the label has been used to diminish fantasy written by women as something that is like, it's not real fantasy, it's romantasy. So there's that kind of aspect to it that I don't particularly like.
I see. And I can see how it can tend to go to that direction as well. And not gonna lie, I love books that are spicy. I love that. And I'm drawn to that. I think that's why these books are so popular. But like you said, it could become problematic for the writers themselves who are like, well, it's one of those things where you're right. It can absolutely, I can see how it can absolutely miscategorize books that are coming out now. And so I thought that would be something worth mentioning. When we met before this recording, we wanted to get into, what are the things that are happening right now with romantasy, So we're going to keep getting into this. We're going to keep getting into the weeds with the certain elements that present themselves and how editors need to handle those things. So, there's so much that I want to cover and we're going to try our best. But I just tapped on it, right? Tapped into a little bit of why we're so drawn to this. Maybe it's the spice, maybe it's the romance scenes, maybe that's but getting me into this. But why does it everywhere? Like, what do you think? I want you to explain, like, why do you think that this has evolved into such a thing? And then maybe we can get a little bit into the alpha male and how the role of the alpha male has evolved in positive ways for the most part.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really popular because it's taken the kind of tropiness of romance that people love, but then smooshed it with this like fun genre of fantasy where, it's escapism and it lets you experience things on the page that you can't experience in real life. And like, the magic systems and everything that let you really dig into a story and really immerse yourself. I think that's part of what makes it so popular. And then you have things like the alpha male, which is a really big trope that I think a lot of people also find attractive because it's kind of like, I see the alpha male and the immorally gray shadow daddy kind of thing. It kind
Yes.
of touches on like dark romance, like it draws from dark romance, but it's in a different universe. So I think in some ways it feels safer or less taboo in romantasy than it would otherwise in something like mafia romance.
Right.
But like you said, the alpha male has come a long way. It's not as, I don't want to say, I don't know, it's still in a morally gray territory a lot of times,
Yeah.
but it's more respectful now than it used to be.
It is. And I've seen it. And I loved that we got to talk a little bit about the mafia romances. I read a few of those. And they are dark. They bring in dark themes. Those books usually come with either a trigger or content warning. And they represent some toxicity, some toxic relationships. And so there's some triggers there. And, that's not my thing, but you don't know it's not your thing unless you give it a try, right? You can't just say, oh, I'm not into that. I wanted to read them. I enjoyed some aspects of those mafia books, but it's that alpha male, the macho, a lot of the toxic traits come out in those books. So, why don't we talk specifically? And I know that you've got some specific things where what is toxic? What is considered there's jealousy, right? It's okay to be jealous, but then what aspects of stories or those specific tropes that come in through romance are toxic or that would raise flags from an editor's perspective that you would flag in a manuscript?
So readers, I think, really like this kind of morally gray territory. They like the jealousy and the possessiveness, and they like the big, strong man.
Yeah.
And I get all of that, and I like it in some ways too, but there's kind of a point where it crosses over from being something that is, delightful and delicious, and then it crosses into abuse or bullying or, things that are toxic that I personally don't think should be on the page. I don't think we should be romanticizing and glamorizing relationships that in real life are harmful and are actually doing real harm to people, right? So, for example, when banter between two characters is no longer banter, but it's actually one character talking to the other like they're an inferior, or like when it's just straight up bullying or abuse, or they're putting another character down, they're not showing the other character respect. Or, for example, when the male character thinks that he knows better than a female main character and takes away her agency in a scenario, even if it's for her own good. You know what I mean? Like, if the male main character is ignoring boundaries, is not being respectful, is taking away agency, like, we need to keep an eye out for these things. And there is a way to write it that is, I think, respectful. Because if we look at, say, the BDSM space and kink, right, there's a lot of consent there. Like, those communities highly value consent and boundaries. And I think that's kind of the framework that editors need to be aware of when looking at something like a morally gray character. We need to watch for, when does this cross over into something harmful and toxic? Whereas when is it just enjoyable and something complex and fun to dig into, right?
Right. An example of like what you're saying is taking the main character's agency away is like locking a woman up because he's trying to protect her, but she's then a prisoner. And so that's no longer, sexy anymore. That's actually cruel. So things like that. You described when we got to chat a little bit, I love that you shared this, which is in actual sex scenes, saying terms that authors use. They're trying, there's aggression or when things get heated up. I mean, again, it's great and it's exciting, but then to use terms like he violated her mouth or something. I love that you shared that because you flagged that as an editor. And I am so proud of you. And I love that you shared that with me because you're like, ew, that's gross.
Yeah.
Like, it's good to be passionate and and I think the author, it's so great for the author to see that because then the author might see your notes and say, oh, maybe I don't need to use the word violate, that he violated her. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, like there are ways to write dominant characters that you do not have to position them as like a conquering and conquered kind of thing. You don't have to use words violated or invaded. You don't have to position things as swords and sheaths, like human beings they're human beings. We are not there to conquer each other. That is not a narrative that I think we should be perpetuating in romance or really anything. So yeah, we need to, as editors, be aware of the language that authors are using when they're writing these kinds of scenes and, point out the potential effects of that type of language.
Yeah, I love it. And this is making me think about the presentation you gave with Molly Rockwood. It was a virtual ACES presentation, and I think it was last year, wasn't it? Well, no, year before maybe. I don't know. I
can't remember.
I can't remember. It doesn't matter. But the point is they actually co-presented on editing sex scenes. And it was one of the best presentations, the way that you both, you were obviously very professional, but covered exactly what you just said about conquering another person and how as an editor, we need to be aware of these things. And authors, they are probably just drawing from, what's been done in the past. They want the books to be dark, and that's great. They can pull from dark or morally gray characters. But I have seen some on the positive side, on these alpha males where they are giving the female main character freedom, a lot of freedom, and that's sexy, right? So so there's a lot there, and we touched a little on how it's evolved, but something you said earlier about complex magic systems. So now I want to get into territory related to like nerdy stuff, like let's talk style sheets. We got to talk style sheets. Like this is the best part of being an editor. It's how our brains work. I want to know when you're editing, the things that are just like signaling or screaming out at you, like, put me in the style sheet, Brenna, list my magic spells. I want to know what you put in your style sheets and how big they can get depending on how long the story is. I mean, let's just talk all things style sheets, complex magic systems, high fantasy, all that stuff.
Sure. So yeah, the more high fantasy, the things that are more complex on the fantasy side are going to end up with bigger style sheets because obviously you have to write down like everything.
Right.
Like it's the basic stuff like character names and place names and the timeline and stuff like that, right? But they also tend to have multiple viewpoints and sometimes there's a map and the map can get pretty complex. And if the author hasn't drawn a map, you might have to draw a map so that you can
Really?
keep things consistent. Well, because
Oh,
sometimes it's like if you want to make sure that it's accurate, you need to make like to know where everything is and you can get really into the weeds with it like how far towns are away from each other and things like that. But there's also like magic spells and how the physics of a certain world works and there's hard magic systems that have rules, but then there's also soft magic systems that can be a little bit more fluid. So depending on the book, you might have to have a more complex style sheet. For me personally, because I do more copy editing and proofreading than like manuscript evaluations or developmental editing, the things that I end up focusing on are like the capitalization of terms. That's a really big one with fantasy because for
yes.
some reason, I don't know if it's just the impulse that, oh, this term is different, so it should be capitalized. But fantasy authors really like to capitalize everything.
Yes.
And it doesn't need to be capitalized. Like not everything needs to be capitalized because it can make a narrative really clunky and draw readers out of a story if, every single magical term is capitalized. So what I like to say to authors is, think about if that word existed in our world and referring to whatever thing it's referring to, would we capitalize it? So, for example, if it's the name of a magical creature, well, do we capitalize names of all of our animals? No, we don't, right? Like if I say cat or dog, those are not capitalized.
Right.
So, if it's a magical creature, even if it doesn't exist in our world, it doesn't necessarily need to have a capital letter. The times when it might need to be capitalized would be like if it's a word that already exists in our world, but it has a slightly different meaning. So, if you have the word law, for example, but it means something different than what we would conceive of as a law, maybe it does need to be capitalized so that you can differentiate it that way. Or if the word in the world has a very specific, important, sacred meaning to its people, maybe it should be capitalized because in that context, it's super important. But there's like all these things to think about whether or not to give that weight to a word or not.
Right, right. I mean, there's a lot of considerations there. And then what about when magical systems become super complex? Are you tracking like spells? Like I mean, what are things that you're putting in? I mean, these are actual elements that are part of the story. Are you tracking them similarly to like a character list?
Yes,
Okay.
because you need to make sure that like spellings are correct and that for consistency, right? If a
Hmm.
character uses this spell in one scene and then they're in another scene that's a similar scenario, you want to make sure they're using the same spell. So you have to write that down. And that's something to think about too when you're an editor going into the project. Take that into consideration with your pricing, right? Like if it's a really complex magic system, it's going to take you a lot longer.
Oh
So
yeah.
make sure that you're charging for that.
Yes, this is exactly the territory I wanted to get into next, which is how to price things or how you handle it. So when you receive a manuscript, I'm just going to assume that not all come with a character list. And if they don't, you are then putting in the time to develop one. And the author or the publisher may or may not publish the book with the character list at the beginning, because some of these stories can have pronunciations that they want to have settled at the very beginning. If there's unique pronunciations for character names or places. So if you were, I guess my question is more, how do you handle both scenarios? Whether you receive a character list, does that help with pricing, or you have your standard rate, and then do you charge, additional fees if you have to develop or create a list like that?
So I have never been given a style sheet or a character list.
Okay.
At least not that I can think of off the top of my head. But I'm
Wow.
always developing that myself, even if I am, like working for a traditional publisher or an indie author, I'm making the style sheet.
Okay.
So usually it's just worked into my price. I add
Okay.
a 10% admin fee to literally every project. And that's
Good.
to make up for some of that. And I think a lot of it comes with experience too, right? Like the more that
Mhm.
you work on a certain type of book, the more that you can get an idea of, okay, this is how long it takes me. This is what I should be charging. So, yeah, I think it comes with time and experience and timing yourself as well, because editors are going to work at different paces depending on who they are.
Absolutely. And that's the great thing about, as a freelancer, you can choose if you want to do hourly, if you want to do per word, flat fee. But I love that you shared this, and I hope listeners write this down, because that is genius to add, at least can take into consideration a 10%, whether you put that on your proposal or just putting it into your fee, raising your rates if you have to accommodate for that additional work that is going into it. That
Oh,
that
yeah.
is outside of the actual editing process. It's you're building, obviously the style sheet we already know, but the character list is another thing. Drawing a map, like that blew my mind that you said that earlier. I mean, that's fabulous. I just, that's so, the fact that you even said that you did that is so cool. I want to just edit romantasy all day.
I
or
remember
just
there is,
fantasy. Go
yeah,
ahead.
there was one book where the characters were on a boat,
Okay.
and depending on the scene and the way that the boat was going, like it was going from one place to another, I had to like draw out where the characters were standing, because it was talking about like port and starboard and and so I'm like, okay, I have
Wow.
to make sure that these are correct. So let me just draw a little diagram.
That is so cool. That is the coolest thing ever. I've never heard this before, but it's going to make me really, really appreciate. And I hope if authors are listening that they truly appreciate the editorial perspective and the fact that we really do. I mean, yes, we look at, if it's sci-fi, which I know that's not our topic today, there's an issue there with like timelines. If you're jumping through time, things that it does have to make logical sense for the story. Obviously, that is fiction, but there's a lot of considerations, a lot there. And with
Yeah, and even with like, so just talking about timelines, like color
Mhm.
coding can help
Yes,
too.
yes.
Like whether it's viewpoints or timelines, or if you want to color code based on where they are in space, like that really helps also with fantasy books.
Another thing, another nuance specific to romantasy is this trend of the telepathic communication. And that's always in italics, right? I mean, what other way can you share that you're speaking through each other's minds? And they always have these shields, and it's like, oh, my shield was down, and whatever. So anyway, I guess the point I'm making is, what if there's an instance where it isn't set in italics and you're editing it and you're like, wait a minute, now you have to flag this for the author, like, was this intended to be telepathic? And you're following the logic of the story, things like that. That's a
Mhm.
specific nuance to romantasy that I've seen, because it's the mated characters who are having this ability because they're soulmates. And I do love, we talked about the tropes, which are, we talked about it before we recorded, which is like that grumpy sunshine, enemies to lovers or friends to lovers. But are there any things similar that you can think of, or those specific nuance that we've seen in romantasy that editors should be like a heightened sense of awareness? Like I mentioned, the telepathic conversations.
Yeah. I think the biggest tropes that I can think of for romantasy are like enemies to lovers is huge because of
yeah.
the tension that's there, right? And then amnesia seems to be a big one, like having one
Oh,
character, usually the female main character, but like forget what has happened and then spend a lot of the book trying to fill in the blanks of her past.
okay.
That's one. And then fated mates is the other really big one for sure.
Yes. Oh, yes. The fated mates. That's the one of the most, and I think that is probably one of the most popular. And with the enemies to lovers, the tension. Oh, you could just soak it up. I love it. Um, so I want to get into maybe some of the darker themes. We can talk specifically about sex scenes you can draw in from your presentation that you gave. I think it was last year, the year before. I want to get into that. And I would love to continue our conversation about the place that AI has right now and what your thoughts are on AI. But I'm going to stop us right now because we will continue this in our exclusive interview. So listeners, if you're interested to hear Brenna get even more specific about the nuance of romantasy, her perspective and opinions on the alpha male, I'd like to get into that a little bit more. Subscribe to my Patreon as a sneak peek, PIQUE, as in Peak Publishing, a sneak peek supporter on Patreon for $5 a month. You'll get access to the exclusive interviews. So Brenna, I'm sad that we have to end it, but you know what? I'm not sad anymore. I used to always say this on the podcast, like, I'm so sad. I don't want to end. And you know what? I'm not sad anymore because now we're going to just keep talking and we're going to continue this in our exclusive interview. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time for this main interview, getting into romantasy. We barely scratched the surface, but I do think that we covered some territory that maybe editors haven't considered or maybe writers will think about when they're working on their magic. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Editor's Half Hour. This podcast is your go-to resource for editorial trends, opening the discussion for new ideas through the real-life stories of editors. For more information about Nadia Jaja Pupa and her business, visit peakpublishing.com.